Good afternoon, everybody. This is Anne Lund, and I'm coming to you on my podcast, Haunted and Waiting, which can be found on the Eye Opener Society platform. Can be found on YouTube, Spotify, Podbeam. So if you haven't subscribed, please do so. I am one of several presenters on that venue. Mine in specific deals with ghosts and haunting, which is my passion. So let me start with today's topic, which is basically ghosts and crime scenes. And if you know anything about me, I am an avid believer of ghosts, and I do believe that they do exist. And I like to provide stories to justify or to verify their existence. So, in starting today's topic, what if a ghost testified at your murder trial? And what if your spirit named your killer or showed up in someone else's dream to point out where you were buried? Well, in today's episode, we're going to explore some real cases where the dead may have helped solve their own murders. And basically, as an overview, I'm going to give you some historical as well as modern ghost solving cases that have been documented, as well as why ghost stories might actually help justice, even if you don't believe in them. There is a value to these stories. So let me start with my own personal story, because I always like to make these podcasts a little bit personal. And this was a story that I had dotted in my marble notebook. So for those of you that have read or listened to my other stories, I have a marble notebook. When anytime anything that I feel doesn't have a logical explanation, I dart it down, and then I look through it. And this is one of the stories that I had dotted in that notebook. This is a true story, and it does come from a town in Europe. It is a town that my parents both lived in and grew up in. And so this story comes from them, as well as other relatives of that age that did remember this story as taking place. So it's factual in that it was an oral tradition. So it was a story that was handed down orally. And it does take place in a town in Europe. Don't want to give the name of the town, but the setting would have been during World War I. It consists of a mother, a father, and two brothers, adult brothers. And I'm going to call this the case of the goats, and you'll see why. So there were these two brothers who apparently one of them was very successful, and he had raised a bunch of goats, and this is how he made his money. But during World War I, he was called off to battle, and he left to fight. And in leaving for the battle, he left the goats to his younger brother. And from what I gathered, the younger brother was a little bit, a little bit loosey-goosey, if I could say, and not very successful guy. But he had no choice, and he left these goats to his brother for their care while he was gone. Now, in the time that he was away for the war, these goats obviously had proliferated, and there were more goats. So they had babies, and there were a bunch of kids. And so now maybe where there was once 10 goats, maybe now there was 20, let's say. When the brother came back, he wanted all of the goats back, feeling that they were his. Now, his brother's argument was, well, I fed them, I took care of them. So yes, you can take your original 10 goats, but the babies are mine. And for whatever reason, I felt like there could have been a compromise. Like maybe he could have said, okay, you take 5 of the babies and I'll take the other 5. But apparently they were headstrong about not wanting any kind of agreement there. And so it became a real bad argument in which the younger brother ended up actually killing the older brother. And then he basically threw him in a ditch and left him there. Now, the mother apparently, obviously very distraught, had no idea what had happened to her son. Now, the father, on the other hand, it's not clear whether he actually knew something was protecting the younger son, but he wasn't saying anything. And then when the mother was asleep one day, she was woken up by the deceased son, who basically admitted to what had happened and basically, my brother killed me, and, here is where I am. Now, most people would say, that the mother was grieving and she was filling in these spaces, which would make a lot of sense. I know I've had dreams. It doesn't necessarily mean they were true, but this son did give an actual setting as to where his body would be found. And so the next day, the mother, against the urging of the father, and this is why I think the father might have known something, ended up going to this area where the brother had given, or her son had given, detailed directions on how to get there. And his body was found in a bunch of cacti, and he had died overnight. So could be a crisis apparition. If you haven't heard that podcast, go to that one, or you can always go to my blog, hauntedandwaiting.blog. I do go into depth in that story about crisis apparitions. So it could be that his ghost came to her just to say goodbye. But the fact that he gave directions on how to find his body, I feel it was more of a situation where he wanted his vindication. I'm not really sure what happened to the brother after that. I guess I can speak to my mom about that, and I'll follow up. And if I do have a blog post that's coming up, you can go on the blog post and read what happened there. But let's move on to some historical cases. And one of the ones that I found, one of the oldest ones, comes from 1897, and this was in West Virginia. So this is an American story. So we've crossed the pond, so to speak. And this one is called the Greenbrier Ghost. Okay, again, happened in 1897. Well documented. I will link the story in my blog if you're interested. And there was a woman that was found dead. Her name was Elva Zona Heister. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. And it was deemed that she died of natural causes. And so she was buried and what have you, and everything was fine. Everyone seemed to believe that she was young. So, unfortunately, her mother, a few nights later, Mary Jane Heister, claimed that her daughter came to visit her again in the middle of the night. And just like the previous story, was telling her mother that she had been murdered. Again, crisis apparition, yes, but I think a little bit more, because here she is telling her mother what happened. So crisis apparition is more like, I'm saying goodbye, I'm okay. This is more like, I'm saying goodbye, but you've got it all wrong. I was killed, and here's some of the information you need to know. And basically, she shocked the mother by saying that her husband, a gentleman by the name of Ursimus, so the dead woman's husband, had actually killed her. So the mother, obviously very distraught, runs over to the authorities and nagging the authorities, listen, my daughter was murdered. She was strangled. She actually told her that she was strangled. And they asked, how do you know? And she said, well, she came to me last night and told me. And of course, the authorities were like, sure thing, whatever you say. Remember now, this was 1897. But she wouldn't leave. And apparently she was there for hours, and she was urging and begging. She's like, please, 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 please. The story got out that she was there, and then neighbors, apparently that knew the couple, had some suspicions that this couple maybe may not have been as happy as they had initially seemed. And so kind of the town rallied up against her, with her. And then that, plus the story of the mother saying that the daughter came to visit her, eventually convinced the authorities to look into it a little bit further. So the first thing they did was they went to the doctor, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Knapp, who said that he admitted, he's like, I really didn't do a complete examination of the body. So, I don't know, I guess it's possible she could have been murdered. And so now those two things, neighbors saying, she may have been killed, plus the dream portion or the ghost portion, they exhumed her body. And so they had another autopsy, second autopsy, and again, the same year, 1897, I think it was like a month later. They did it in a schoolhouse, and it lasted 3 hours. And at the end of that, the Dr. Knapp did find out that her neck had been broken and she had been killed. They went out, got some more evidence, and apparently then the husband was convicted and charged of her murder. So the evidence was so strong that the ghost had provided, and the news had gotten out that a lynch mob actually formed, and the townspeople actually went to the jail wanting to hang him, but the mob was disbanded. Obviously, they didn't lynch him, but he was convicted. And why this case is so notable is it is the only United States trial where a ghost's testimony was actually admitted as evidence. So, and that led to a conviction. So it's interesting. I will link the blog, this in my blog as well. Let's move forward now to 1977. We're in Chicago, Illinois, and there was a woman by the name of Teresita Basa. This is a really sad case. This woman was murdered in 1977. In her house. She was born in the Philippines in 1929, so she was up there in age. She was a very quiet, soft-spoken person, had no enemies. She became a respiratory therapist wanting to help people. She was the last person you would expect to be murdered. She had no known enemies, like I said, and this is what was so difficult for the investigation of her trial. There was like no leads. And apparently in February of 1977, there was a fire in her apartment. And when they put out the fire, they found her body. It was naked and there was a butcher's knife buried in her chest. And so it seemed like this fire was arson, and whoever set it to hide the murder or any evidence of. So no leads, no motive. It kind of went like cold case file. I would imagine also that she was an immigrant, probably not a lot of family members here to keep the case going, so they kind of just fell in the cracks. It was more than 5 months later that one of her coworkers, a woman by the name of Remi Chua, I'm going to refer to her. She's also from the Philippines. I'm going to refer to her as Remi because in all of the documents I've read, they have the name Remi in quotes. So Remi contacted detectives claiming that she had key information about this murder. And so the detectives met with her thinking, she had some like hard evidence, but the only evidence she had was that Teresita, the murdered woman, was appearing to her at night as an apparition, begging her to go to the police and tell what had happened to her, and namely that she had been killed. And interestingly enough, she gave the name of her murderer, a man named Alan Showery. This is where it gets really weird. Not only does she have the guy's name, but she provided details, namely that Teresita, the dead woman's jewelry, had been stolen. This was not originally discovered in the case, and that this gentleman, Alan, had given the jewelry to his girlfriend. Now, this gentleman had no connection to Remi. This was just a name that was pulled out of the blue, and she didn't know the guy, didn't know the guy had a girlfriend, so this was evidence that she couldn't have gotten any way, shape, or form other than from this apparition. Now, amazingly, once confronted, this guy, Alan, he confessed to the murder. And he confessed to giving the jewelry to his girlfriend, and that being the cause of the murder or the reason of the murder. He served 14 years. Fortunately, it was released in 1983. So this murderer is walking free right now, unless he has passed, which is possible. Okay, ready for some more? Because I'm going to go to Australia now, Campbelltown, actually. This story takes place in 1826. This was a really interesting case. I found so many, but I kind of just pulled the really interesting ones. So this one is about a man named Frederick Fisher. Okay, and it happened in 1826. Not a good man by any lack of the imagination. He had already served 14 years for a white-collar crime, but he had been released. After his release, he bought some property, again in Australia, and he spent years there. He became a carpenter. Little shady of a guy, some stuff, but nothing really major, a lot of white-collar crime, but apparently this is where it gets good. He ended up with a fight with his neighbor, a man named George Worrell, and he ended up stabbing this guy. So apparently, never been a physical altercation except for this one time where he stabbed his neighbor, a guy named George. George doesn't die; he's injured, but he does go to the authorities. Obviously, where Frederick goes to jail again. He gets what was called a light sentence. I'm not sure what that means. It didn't say how long, but he does get released in 1826. Okay, and then shortly after his release, he disappears. So George, the guy that was stabbed, said that he had information that this guy, Fred, had committed some forgery, and he left the country or left the area because he didn't want to go back to jail. Okay, everybody kind of believed it in a way, but there was some suspicion, especially after George ends up selling Fisher's horse and his personal belongings. That caused more suspicion. But here's where our ghost comes into play. The ghost of Frederick Fisher, apparently in October of the same year, appears to this respected farmer by the name, I kid you not, John Farley was his name. And John Farley, again, because he was a respected farmer, a good standing, he claimed and he swore that he saw the ghost of Frederick Fisher. People had asked, well, maybe it was just Frederick Fisher. And he was saying, no, it wasn't him because I saw him. And then he kind of just faded away into a mist. And he claims that when he saw him, he was pointing into a paddock in a creek. And this creek was on George Worrell's land. Okay. So this caused, again, the authorities to go to George's land, where they found Fred Fisher lying in a shallow grave. So this caused more investigations, which then proved that Worrell was, in fact, the murderer. And it was just a case of revenge for having been stabbed. He was eventually executed. So that was that. I will link that story also in my blog. So in closing, why might ghosts or representations aid in solving crimes? Well, whether you want to actually believe that a ghost is actually giving a message or not, or it's just coincidence, there's a lot of reasons why ghost, or mention of a ghost, I should say, will help with the crime. First of all, there's emotions involved, right? Emotional resonance, we're going to call it. So when these stories come out, it evokes an emotion in you. Like, for instance, the mother, saying that her daughter came to her. I mean, how could you not have an emotional response to that, or the other mother with her son? So it raises a lot of emotions, and emotions cause action. So, something like that could actually cause an investigation to continue where it would otherwise had ended. There's also a thing called a memory stimulation. This is kind of weird, but it's believed that when stories get out like this, it actually triggers memories and witnesses that maybe they didn't remember at the time. So, for instance, if someone says something about jewelry, and the ghost was talking about jewelry, and then a coworker says, "Oh yeah, she had beautiful jewelry." The person might not have remembered that unless it was mentioned by a ghost. So that's another situation that can happen. It also sparks renewed public interest. So any mention of a ghost is just going to make the public a little bit more interested in the case. I know for me, for sure. There was an actual interesting case in 2024. This just happened, actually. And they call it the holographic revival of Betty Szabo's murder. So Betty Szabo was murdered in the red light district in Amsterdam. She was only 19 years old. And so, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, she may have been a night worker. A lot of times those cases don't get a lot of, I guess, people don't look into them a lot. It's kind of almost expected, sad to say. But the police department, what they did was they got a life-size hologram of Betty, totally fake, not a ghost whatsoever. And they posted it in windows where she was depicting her reaching out with the word help appearing on the glass. So they actually created a ghost-like image of her. It wasn't really a ghost, but they created this image, and that caused them to look into the case itself, and actually did solve the case, believe it or not, just from this hologram. So, and the final thing is something called a psychological impact. Perpetrators, when they are confronted with these things, so like in the case of the woman that was burned, when they came to the murderer and they said her ghost said this about you, he immediately confessed. It's almost like they won't deny ghostly intervention or information from a ghostly intervention, and they confess. And you could find a lot of those stories. It becomes a fear factor with them. It's like they're scared, like this ghost is after them, and they just confess to come clean. So that's my last thing. So my final thoughts: whether you believe in ghosts or not, these stories do show that the dead sometimes speak, and when they do, justice listens. So, do you have your own spooky crime story? Just message us here at the Eye Opener Society, or you can find me on hauntedandwaiting.blog or Haunted and Waiting on Facebook. It's a Facebook group, very small group, by the way. Or you can now find me on TikTok, Haunted and Waiting at Ann Lund 333. And then just message me. Or you can even subscribe to my blog or to the podcast, so you can get more stories on the podcast. I do share a story about once a month. So I'd love to hear you or have you follow us there. We have other presenters who we do a lot of stuff there. And so not only ghost stuff, but a lot of metaphysical things. So please join if you're into alternative ways of thinking. So in closing, just remember, you yourself may be haunted and waiting, and I hope to hear from you soon. Goodbye. This is Ann Lind.